Hello again. Welcome to Screencast number 3. Let's work on finishing this up, okay? So we just went through personality, we went through self, we went through identity. I want to sort of give a couple of visual images to help us understand the relationship between these, okay? So I could not figure out for the life of me how to get these to go in order that I wanted to go. So they're going to sort of be a little more backwards than I want them to be. But take a look at this. This is a visual representation. So you've got the big circle, which is identity. Identity is going to encapsulate self and personality. And so ultimately, this is what we're talking about when how they're not the same thing, but you can't really pull them apart either, right? So up here you have the overall identity, which is the composite of these two. You've got self and personality. Personality is most core. Remember, this is the nurture, this is the nature. You put it together and you have identity, okay? So that's a pretty decent way of viewing what we're talking about here. I hope that sort of helps you kind of have it stick, okay? Another way to look at it is this way. You can take self, you can take personality, you take identity, you stir it all up, you mix it down into one thing, and what it becomes is you, all right? You, who you see yourself as. And the interaction between much of this has to do with the way that you communicate with yourself, being intrapersonal communication, not just the self over here. Okay, so these are just a couple of visual ways for us to understand really how all of this stuff works together. Okay. Now let's talk just briefly about how the self-concept develops, because I said earlier that intrapersonal communication is an intimate part of all this. Well, here we go to explain it. Some of this will seem familiar if you've had an interpersonal communication class. In interpersonal communication, we talk about how the self-concept develops in our interaction with others. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing that. I'm going to talk about how it forms within ourselves, okay? So first of all, we have to talk about how the self-concept does not exist at birth. That does not mean, again, we're talking about self here, right? Self-concept is the perceptions you hold of yourself. When you're born, you don't have perceptions of yourself yet, okay? You're not self-aware when you're first born, okay? Coming into self-awareness is something that happens to us over the first couple of 3 years of our lives, okay? So the self-concept does not exist at birth. Now, pieces of your personality and stuff like that arguably are there, okay? So that's what we're talking about here, okay? The self-concept does not exist at birth. And so here's how it happens. Interaction with self and others shapes the way we view ourselves. And so the way you interact within yourself shapes how you view yourself. It happens in two ways. The first is called reflected appraisal. Now, we talk about this in interpersonal communication. For us in this class, we're going to talk a little bit differently about it, all right? So reflected appraisal are my perceptions of the judgments of those around me. So the way that I see myself reflected back by others. I hope that makes sense. The ways that other people communicate with us tell us things about ourselves, and that's reflected appraisal, okay? But they are my perceptions of the judgments of those around me. So another way to say it is the way I communicate with myself, so intrapersonally, right? The way I communicate with myself about others' messages shapes my self-concept. So intrapersonal communication is intricately intertwined with how you formulate your self-concept in the realm of reflected appraisal, okay? This is why it's so important for us to be around people when we're young who acknowledge us, who give us positive nonverbals and warm nonverbals, people who grow up in environments that are very harsh and very not non-verbally warm. I'm not sure if I said that clearly or not. The reflected appraisal that they're going to take part in is actually going to create a self-concept that is not good in many cases. You can't guarantee it because we are talking about the nurture part here, right? So you can't guarantee anything really with nurture, but you can set up some good patterns. And so then social comparison is the second. So first is reflected appraisal, my perceptions of the judgments of those around me, okay? Social comparison is where I then communicate with myself in an evaluative way in terms of how I compare with other people. So I am going to get reflected appraisal. I'm going to take that information, and then I'm going to socially compare myself, and I'm going to intrapersonally communicate and make sense of what I'm seeing. And so that is how the self-concept works in regard to forming with intrapersonal communication. Our interactions with others are certainly a part of it, but the ways that we communicate with ourselves play a very big role in how we form our self-concept. And so another possible reflection that we're not going to do was what sorts of ways do you communicate with yourself about others' messages? See, this is not always accurate. It is a perception. And so sometimes we communicate with ourselves about other people's messages and it's wrong. Sometimes it's right. Sometimes it's dead on. But we sometimes get a reflection of ourselves and others that we don't really understand and have a hard time making sense of. And then when we socially compare, it can make it better or worse. And so this is a really interesting thing with how the self-concept happens. And so we come here to this, okay? So the self-concept is powerful. These perceptions that you have, this process of reflected appraisal and social comparison becomes very, very powerful. It not only determines how you see yourself, because it does. It determines how you see yourself, but it also can affect your future behavior. So it affects how you see yourself now. But what happens is how you begin to see yourself with your self-concept then can actually affect your behavior. And the way that you see yourself can affect the behavior of others too. So this is a really important concept to wrap our mind around. The ways that you communicate with yourself impact you on the behavioral level. It's not just a mental thing. It actually has to do with how you see yourself, how you understand yourself, your self-esteem, and then all of that plays out in the way that we behave, especially communicatively, how we treat other people, how we treat ourselves, what we even think we're capable of in life. I have seen so many people who will not even apply for a job that they are 100% qualified for and would be wonderful at, simply because their self-concept does not have that piece, like they never thought that's something they could be or do. And oftentimes, the problem is not getting someone to apply. The problem is getting them to open themselves up to actually the possibility that they could be that. So the self-concept determines how you see yourself and your behavior and the behavior of others in many ways, okay? So I don't want to spend too much time. Let's wrap up, okay? Intrapersonal communication plays an intimate role in the continual formation, management, and navigation of our sense of self. We've talked about that. It's there at every level as we go through this. Our self-talk impacts our self-concept and our self-esteem, the ways that we talk to ourselves, the ways that we internally relate with ourselves, the ways that we have dialogue within ourselves, impacts how we see ourselves, impacts how we behave, impacts the meaning we make within ourselves. We could say another way that we impact our inner realities of self with our self-talk. The ways that we communicate with ourselves and forms self, and that creates realities for us. The process of interpersonal communication and intrapersonal communication are inextricably linked, with each affecting and impacting on the other. This is why it's so important to learn to really understand yourself, and why it's really important to start to do the work of improving your intrapersonal communication. I have a lot of students who will take interpersonal communication. They'll learn about how to communicate with another person, but some of the patterns will still persist in their life because they focus on the outward but not the inward. And oftentimes, you got to get the inward in order for the outward to start to fall into some semblance of order as well, because this stuff that's inside is something that you live in constantly, every single day. And so you have to make sure you get that going, okay? How people interact with others will affect how they see themselves. Likewise, how they see themselves will impact how they interact with others. And so this idea of intrapersonal communication being linked to our outward relationships is really important. It's a big part of why we do this. It's not just about getting your head straight and being able to communicate with yourself. It's about getting all those things in order, but then being able to improve the inner reality and the outer realities that you're a part of. So this week, there's a lot of video to watch. I hope that you enjoyed the TED Talk. You'll be able to knock out these screencasts pretty quickly. And then after this is a documentary. It's part one of a documentary called The Century of the Self. And the reason why I'm assigning that for our discussion is that we have this internal stuff going on within ourselves, but there are outside forces that have a stake in how we communicate with ourselves. And I want you to just watch that documentary. It's just under an hour long. It's pretty interesting, or at least I think it is. Some of you may have seen pieces of it in some of my other classes, but what it does is it talks about how outside forces are there to try to get you to communicate with yourself in certain ways so that you behave in certain ways. Okay? So I wish it were just us and the people in our life, but there are even bigger, more outside forces that we have to contend with to make our realities, our communicative realities anyway, ones we like and enjoy. So I look forward to engaging you on the discussion boards. They're going so well. You're saying such good things. You're treating each other with respect. It's going really, really great. I'll see you in the boards and in your journals.